All right, but here is the big juicy T-bone. We're gonna go over this big tier list. We got 20 something decks here. Um, but we'll start at the top. We're gonna go over the first one with Scouts. I know a lot of people are surprised, but yes, Scouts in its glorious 9 Bilgewater uh pride glory. Anyway,
And
um yeah, we just see this deck crush everything. Um, any 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 aggro deck just gets traded on. Any mid range deck gets outpaced. Any control deck just gets outrun. Um, this deck is immaculate.
right, I don't. We've talked. This is I hate to say it, but this is like the new Heimer for Meta World almost. This is
I
the
know,
deck
going
you
from the deck with the most lines of play to probably the least. It's
just
really
one,
sad.
two, three Bannerman. Yeah, I mean there are niches. This deck is not. There are more brainless decks than that. This I will say, but I won't try to make. I won't try to lie to you and say this is a big brain deck and you need a 200 IQ to play this deck. There are niches though, and that's what's going to separate the Masters players from the Silver 3 players. No offense to any of you who are Silver 3, but this
Right.
is
I think we
definitely
we see even in the worst, stupidest LOR decks, there are room for player involvement. There's always going to
right.
be a level of skill, whether or not certain decks exemplify that. I think we've seen decks like Heimer and Ezreal really show like the good from the bad. But continue.
Right. So I mean, this deck is nuts. If we play 9-1s, which that's the biggest, that's the thing we have to fight people on about the most. It's the probably the number one argument here at Meta World Gaming is why do we play 9-1s? And 9-1s is just broken. That's the first thing I guess I can say about it. The consistency, arbitrarily, I don't have a number to put on this because we don't have like a Hearthstone or something that tells us our win rate when we open certain cards, but arbitrarily, I've played, I think, around 400 or 500 games with this deck now, and that is a number that I actually have recorded. Um, and I can tell you that my win rate is so much higher when I start a one, especially when they don't. Especially when you're playing other aggro decks and they only have 6-1s, so you're so much more likely to hit a one drop than them. But even more so against the control decks, opening the one drop is so important, especially when your two drops lead up into that one drop. So War Chefs needs a one drop, Brightsteel needs a one drop. Those guys need a one drop to get their maximum effectiveness. And it doesn't end just there. One drops help fill in curves. They let you underdrop if you, for some reason, need to bank mana for a Ranger's Resolve or maybe even a single combat, although that's a little less common. They do so well for like turns where you have to underdrop, so you're on 3 and you have a War Chefs, but now you have a one drop, so you can fill that out. You can fill out your curve and not have to miss a drop and lose tempo because you don't ever want to be banking mana for the most part with this deck. If you do, one drops come in handy there, like I mentioned, where say it's turn 2 and I have a 2 drop and a 1 drop, but I have Ranger's Resolve in hand and I'm playing against, say, TF Swain, a deck where I know I'm going to have Ranger's Resolve casted and I need that mana available as soon as possible. So I really think 9 1 drops is absolutely the way to go. I think there's a little bit of argument to be had for the second point most people bring up, which is 9 Bilgewater cards.
Yeah, and we've seen it
Um,
come up time and time again where people are like, oh, the allegiance is just too inconsistent when you play that and everything that goes along with that. And if you really feel that strongly about it, you can play. The Protege isn't the worst card ever. It's actually a really strong card. But what this deck does, and to make this deck as consistent as possible, I think Petty Officer is what you want. And Petty Officer, while it does pair well with Bannerman, Petty Officer allows Bannerman to not be as essential because Bannerman is only a 3 of. You can't get it every game. You even get situations where you can't actually play it on turn 4 because they might have dealt with your board or something, so you have to play it later in the game. But Petty Officer is always just making your board wide and its stats, and it just does exactly what this deck needs. And I think that's worth the allegiance being not as important because That's all this deck tries to do, is be as consistent as possible. So whenever somebody says, you can never call Scouts a high roll deck. You can say it's brainless, but it's not high roll, because that's the whole point of it. It's incredibly consistent.
Right. It does the same thing every game. And like he said, Protege is a good substitute for Petty Officer, especially. I would even consider Protege if I'm playing on ladder one day and every deck I'm playing against is Scouts or some type of Damasha aggro. I'll cut Petty Officer for Protege because he's just much better, especially when you pair him with things like War Chefs and Bright Steel. You need to take trades. Trades are huge in a mirror match. And you have Misfortune, so you can grab 1 health guys and kill them for free or just trade them off or whatever you need to do. So I think there's argument for that. But in my mind, there's no argument to me for anything less than 9/1 drops. If you want to make your Bannermans more consistent, go ahead, cut the Petty Officer for Protege. But I can't be sold off of 9/1s. I've played enough now to know that 9/1s is absolutely the truth for a deck like this.
Yeah. So here's a little story about beta where I played. I forgot what month it was, probably one of the earlier months, like a February or something, and I encountered a deck that played only 1-drops, and I lost, because I realized that there's nothing to do to 1-drops. You can't stop 1-drops. The only thing to stop a 1-drop is another 1-drop, and when I have 1-drops and you don't, my guy is just snowballing for damage, and it creates a meta that we've seen where decks shift to, I'm playing a bunch of 1-drops now. And like I said at the top of the podcast, was that we just seen a lot of decks in mid-range or even aggro early game center decks that just play 6 to 9 1-drops, and that's standard now. But we never saw that before. But I think it's just people realize the power of 1-drops now and how good they are.
So we're getting some questions here, and this is the deck that not that we're unequipped to answer questions about the other deck, but this is the deck I feel we can most comfortably tell. I can with 100% confidence answer just about any question about this deck. So
we've played a couple games with it for sure. All right, Bendro the Butts says, when playing against Scouts, something like Ramp, is it important to play around board wipes like Avalanche or Icequake, or is it better to play into it and accept board wipes are a reality of life? You play into it when you don't. If you can avoid them, then sure. But if you're in a situation where if I play around it, I'm going to lose, then of course you can't. You just accept it. They only have 3 Avalanche in their deck. They're likely to not have it. But if you can put yourself in a situation to avoid it, then of course.
And a thing too to remember against those decks is, so a lot of your curve has 3 health. It's only your 1-drops that really have 2 health, and Bright Steel and Petty Officer, I guess, too, but he makes another drop, so you're still getting tempo unless they avalanche you on the spot. Against those decks, something I do, especially when I already have a curve in hand, so let's say I have a 1 and a 2, I'll keep Ranger's Resolve, because I know that probably the only way they're going to be able to win is to avalanche me. So I'll do things like I'll keep Ranger's Resolve. I'll look for more of a curve with 3 health, so let's say I open like against a deck with Avalanche. Let's say I open 3 1-drops and no Ranger's Resolve. I might ship 2 of the 1-drops and try to find a War Chefs, so I have something that I know is going to survive the Avalanche. And another thing too is, because you have cards like Petty Officer and Grizzled Ranger, you have some level of resilience or ability to rebuild board after an Avalanche. So take your open attacks. Don't get greedy. Don't think, oh, I'm going to play all my cards and try to get as much damage as possible. Think every time you go into a turn when you're ready to attack, how badly do I lose to Avalanche? If I play, let's say if I play my Petty Officer here on 3 and he avalanches me, can I rebuild the board? Am I going to lose the game? Does losing this tempo lose me the game? Or am I okay to open attack with my War Chefs and my Cythria and just take the 6 damage? And then he can't avalanche me this turn because he's only getting 1 card. He's not clipping most of my board. So it's you really just have to think and realize, when do I open attack? When is it okay to maybe give up my board for the extra damage because I either have Ranger's Resolve, or I can rebuild the board, or he's so low on health that he's just not going to be able to defend himself long enough. And I think that's something that separates the good Scout players from the bad, is recognizing how to play around AoE and when it's acceptable to play into it.
Yeah, I think it just goes back to simply, If you can play around it, then yes, and recognize when you can. And it is hard to recognize when you can and can't, because if you just play around everything, you'll find yourself losing a lot and losing more games than you should because you're afraid of things. However, when you can put yourself in a situation where you can play around it effectively, then yes, it's good. But I think it's as simple as that, is when you can play around it.
Let's see. I'm looking at some other no pursuits. So my idea with this deck has always been to play as little spells as possible. You really just want to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and just don't bank any spell mana whenever possible, unless you absolutely have to bank for, say, a Ranger's Resolve, or very rarely a single combat. I don't think I've ever missed a drop to bank for single combat, but I have for Ranger's Resolve, and that you really can't be banking for spells. A lot of times too, this deck isn't always in a position to play Pursuit. Like, Pursuit feels like a win more card to me. Like, if I can play Pursuit and they're going to get blown out by it, they probably weren't in a great position to begin with. So no, I'm not really a fan of Pursuit. I already think 4 spells is too much, quite honestly. If I could justify myself cutting the single combats, I probably would. There's just not much else to play. And there are some decks that I really do want to see single combat against. It's one of the few outs. So Ezreal is one. Fiora is the biggest, because you don't really have a way to kill Fiora if they don't want you to. And single combat is the only card that really lets you catch them off guard and potentially kill Fiora, which is just an absolute nightmare for this deck. It's one of the few cards it's one of the few decks when I queue into it, I'm like, I'm probably going to lose this if they see Fiora. So
Yeah, I agree that it's simply too much mana for a deck like this that really doesn't even have enough mana to play single combat a lot, let alone a 3 mana card and a very situational one. I think that if the meta was in a certain way where, so like Pursuit is good against like an Ezreal deck, I would say Pursuit is probably better than single combat against an Ezreal deck in a lot of situations, because they like play, let's say they play a champion and they just need to pass and bank mana, you can Pursuit to get that last attack in to win. Or against Heimer, Pursuit used to be really broken, because like I would play Heimer and I just need that one turn to build my board back up, but if you could get another attack in, then I'm gonna lose. So I think that Pursuit's like on the cusp of this deck, but the units are just so much better. The weight of units are so much higher than spells, and even a powerful effect like Rally does not make it for me. Yeah, but I think we're gonna move on to numero uno on the S tier, which is the same as last week. It's where the fuck did I put it? There it is, Mr. Swain, TF Swain. This deck is similar to Scouts in that we see that it just doesn't have that many bad matchups, and that's why it's strong right now, especially in a very experimental part of the meta. Less so than it was last week. The dust has settled to a certain extent, but we just see that Swain TF is really primed to beat a multitude of decks. Against the Asol decks, you have this turn 8 to 9 where you can just play the Leviathan and stun their board, and they don't have great removal tools, especially consistent removal tools, because we do see that the Celestials that does have something there, but it has a lot of different game plans for a wide array of decks against mid-range and slow and fast decks. You can blow them out with cards like Make It Rain and Barrels and Twisted Fate, and just establish a strong board. And then it always comes down to when you can establish Swain and Leviathan against a lot of decks where it's, okay, I locked the board up and you're never going to do a thing again. So it's getting to that point and establishing when that point's important, which against, like I said, a deck like Asol, you really have to be on top of that, because before they can drop the Asol, and then it all just goes to hell because they level up, and then you're just never going to get the board under control again. But yeah, this deck is just really primed to beat. It reminds me a lot of decks that we've seen popular in Legends and Runeterra, where just they have few bad matchups, true bad matchups. So like a true bad matchup for Swain would be something that we don't see a lot, like an Ezreal Karma, or excuse me, like a spooky Karma, where Ruination would just really crush this deck in a lot of instances. But we don't see a control Shadow Isles really played at the moment in that capacity. We do see things like Warmother, but they don't play Ruination anymore. But yes, we just see deck. I call them hedge decks. They just have a lot of fair, good matchups. Nothing punishes it. And this is a prime example of that.
Right, and I think one of the big things is with a lot of aggro decks, things like Scout running around. This deck has one thing that all those other decks don't have really, and that's instant speed AoE. So things like when you put a barrel down and you have things like Make It Rain and it becomes a pseudo avalanche, or you have my version plays what is it called? Blood Lotus? Is that the
Death
I
Lotus.
was Death Lotus, thank you. So my version plays Death Lotus over the House Spider. So even a card like that, you do 2 to everything attacking, which if you're playing against a Scouts deck or an aggro deck is usually everything. So you have this instant speed AoE, so you don't have to be as worried about them taking the open and trying to play around your AoE maybe. You can still prevent the damage, wipe their board, and even if you rebuild, you still stop the damage, so you don't feel as bad about it. Um, I think this deck it has a near unstoppable late game, which is something not too many decks have in the form of Swain with the Leviathan. So once you have those two decks, once you have those two cards on board, any mid-range or aggro deck for the most part just it doesn't really have a way to deal. They're just their board is locked down, and you're kind of able to just keep swinging through every single turn. And the last part I like about this deck is it does have the option to go aggro. You have enough early game and a little bit of burn too, where this deck can be aggressive against control decks if it wants to. It does. It can close maybe like 10 damage before turn 5 or 6, which a lot of control or decks kind of like this can't really do. So you can curve like House Spider if you're playing it into Petty Officer, into Zap Sprayfin, and you've got, let's say, 9 to 10 damage on board or whatever. This deck can, if it needs to be aggressive and kind of forces them to answer your board. Meanwhile, you're kind of just trying to buy time till you get to that Leviathan Swain, or maybe you have like a Twisted Fate and you're just trying to level them up, and they can't really kill him, or they waste all their removal before you play him trying to deal with your board.
So this is a very stock list that I decided to put up on here. And while I'm usually against that, I do think that there's a lot of variation in the Swain. Not a lot, but like a healthy amount of tech. So cards that we've seen recently is the deck that we used for our master push was we played 3 Death Lotus over the House Spiders. And while I did think that they were good in its limited capacity, I think House Spider is the more consistent card. But I would also like to test that more and see where in what situations and circumstances Death Lotus performs better in, and then you can adjust your deck based on that information for certain metas. Other cards have been Noxian Guillotine has been played a good amount in a 1 or 2 copy of. I think that card's okay. It's against more control decks. It's very valuable. So you could go something like Make It Rain, and then you have a lot of like this weak chip AoE damage with the Twisted Fate, Make It Rain, things like that, or even Riptide Rex sometimes. And then you could just take their big threats off the board. You could even make tempo plays for lethal with that, where you could just kill like their big bodies and then swing for lethal, things like that. So I think that Noxian Guillotine is an interesting 1 or 2 of. Other things other than those 2 cards that we've seen, we've seen people go back to 3 Rex. We have seen some people even play Plunder once in a while. The OG version of this deck definitely played the Plunder package. I do think it's not what it makes this deck more clunky, which I dislike. And then you have to play activators for things like the Plunders, and I don't like that. So this is my preferred version at the moment. I would have to think about minor adjustments to it, but this will be, I think, for the 1.8 meta, you're looking at the 2 best decks in TF, Swain and Scouts. They just define the meta currently.
Um, Darthenos says he hates having 8 drops in hands versus MS scouts. Well, the
Well,
idea is that, right, you hate that. Ideally, you don't draw it till, like, in a perfect world, you want to top deck it on turn like 7 or 8. But the deck has enough stall that ideally you want to just make it to that. Ideally, you'll have Swain on the board already. You don't even need to search him and play him with this. But once you get to that 8 drop versus scouts, there's really nothing they can do unless you're at like less than 5 life total and they have a full board and you just have nothing. If you have the boat and Swain down, there's not much a Scout's deck can do to you. You're locking down 3 guys a turn, plus you have 2 massive blockers on the board. It's very unlikely that they're ever able to overrun you or even break through for damage for the rest of the game. And that's usually when I, as a Scouts player, scoop it up. Once they get the boat and Swain down, I very seldom have ever won a game once that happens.
yeah, it makes it, especially for a deck like Scouts, where you can prevent. So I think Scouts actually has a pretty good matchup against TSOA. Not great, but good, because it has a fat mid, like a early to mid game. But once they can get the boat down with Swain, if it ever gets to that point, you're screwed.
Right. Yeah, there's not really any removal for the boat. You can get Swain maybe when he's unevolved with a single combat and you have like Cythria the Bold, or like you have a boosted Genevieve or something, but I would say it's very unlikely you're going to ever be able to remove one of them if they don't want you to.
All right, and with that said, we're gonna take I don't want to say a full step, but like a half step down, because I think these decks are A, unproven, and B, still the lists are being figured out. And this is a Leona Asol deck. We've seen a lot of Demacia Asol decks, which are really strong also. If you guys have a particular version you want to see, then that's great. And I'll probably add one later also, because I do see that deck is really popular. I like it because they're playing like Genevieve and Radiant Guardian and a lot of strong cards that I think are great for the meta. But this is a classic. I don't remember who I took this deck from. It might be an Alan ZQ list. But just we can definitely identify like the really solid core of the deck, where it has a great early mid-range game where you can match these aggressive decks like a Scouts or just a multitude of different strategies that we see in the aggro lineup. So you just have like a really solid board. You have a lot of healing options. Scryer is really strong when you're in a lot of these matchups, so you can just pop off with your invoke cards. The Ravoon, we talked about how great this is, such a well-made card to make Daybreak very consistent and a strong archetype. Strong wow, brain fart. Strong combat cards like Pale Cascade and Troll Chant, probably two of the best. Especially Troll Chant is one of the best stat modifiers we've ever seen for its cost. Hush, just a spot card where it works in a lot of situations and against a lot of decks, but also you don't always need it, which is great. Star Shaping is a card that when it was previewed, I really wasn't that excited about. I felt like it could be too, not bad, but not good enough to see a lot of play. But we've seen aggro is the name of the game, and you need to heal, so Star Shaping is a must-have in all of these decks. And then Leona. Leona's just a really strong mid-range card. It can be defensive as like a stopgap until you get to your Asol turns, or you can even put the pedal to the metal and start stunning the board a ton with the Ravoon. You could even, if you're really feeling lucky, you could get her champ spell and go hog wild on the board, just stun everything, have a huge board. This deck is also very versatile. It matches up well with a lot of things. How do you feel about this deck? I think that there are better versions, and I will change this deck actually right now as you talk.
So I guess I'll talk. What I want to talk about with this deck already kind of came in the form of a question. Could this list survive heavy aggro? And actually, I think that's the advantage to this list over, say, the Asol Ramp deck, is that it can survive heavy aggro. So you have the big cards you have Solaris Shieldbringer, and against aggro decks, especially ones that don't have burn, that can just shut down a whole turn. Like if I have the attack on 2 with Scouts, for example, and you play that against me, that shuts down my whole attack. I'm not throwing away a guy to get in 2 or 3 damage or whatever. I need my board. Or even on like 3 or 4, I still am hesitant to attack because I don't really want to throw away a creature for a very small amount of damage. And then you get into the rest of the curve where you have, let's say, Leona into Raven or Rayvoon or however you say his name. Yeah, Ravoon. Ravoon's a solid wall. He's a 5/5. That's hard for aggro decks in general to get over. He creates a card, so they're never going to be able to take maybe even a value trade. And most importantly, he makes it so it's always day. So your daybreaks are always triggering, so you can just kind of ram out a wall of dudes. Like you can play Solari Soldier, Shield Breaker. When Leona's evolved, she's stunning every guy, and that's huge. Leona helps kind of make a wall with Rayvoon where you can just keep curving these big daybreak guys and stunning them and locking them down for the turn. On top of having a wall of guys, Leona's a 4/6 when she's leveled. Rayvoon's a 5/5, as we said. Even Solari Soldier just by himself is a 3/3 the turn you play him. So all these guys are very well overstated, and it makes it, especially for decks that don't have burn, it's hard to justify throwing guys into them for a little bit of damage because once your board's gone, there's no follow up. Maybe with like when we see these spiders burn decks, they can kind of attack a little bit more leisurely because they have burn to finish the game, and they're okay with throwing some of their board away because they have a way to finish the game. But decks like Scouts, they don't have a way to finish the game. Decks like Nightfall is a little bit of burn, but even they don't have a ton of ways to kind of close the game. They have like the 2/3 elusive. They have the 3/2, the Dustbringer or whatever, who eats for 2. So they have like a few cards that let them kind of cheese, but even they don't want to really throw their boards away like that. So I think this deck fares pretty well versus aggro as long as you curve right. I mean, that's always the name of the game. But you even have like Troll Chant, which is incredibly good versus aggro. You have Star Shaping to heal 5. And you do have, unlike a lot of mid-range decks, you do have a real win condition. You have Aurelion Soul. So you're not just going to get to the end of the game, stabilize, and then be like, oh, wait, now I'm going to get burned out because I can't win the game for 5 turns because I don't have an actual win condition. So I think this deck is pretty solid. Someone mentioned it earlier, but I do think Behold the Infinite is pretty sketchy. I don't think it's a bad card.
I haven't played with it at all, but it does strike me as like maybe not the best card.
Right. It's not concentrate. It doesn't find of a specific cost. So this can find me anything from the 4/1 with Overwhelm to the 10 drop that I will literally probably never play in this deck. So there are some good cards to find off of it, and I understand where it might see some value, but I'm not sold on it. I won't go as far as to call it a bad card, but I'm skeptical.
Yeah, I have my reservations, especially at 3 copies. I think it could be a decent value card at certain stages of the game, and it might be good enough to play, but 3 copies is staring at me like a sore thumb.
Yeah, this is also a deck. One last little thought here. This is a deck I would play Hush in, but I think 2 is a bit much. I would probably still only play 1 Hush in this deck.
Yeah, also something that I noticed was just not really doing it for me in that capacity would be the 2 Hush. It's just so limited in its use because of how situational it is. But it's good when you need it, and I think you could just look for it in that case. So this is the other version. One second, I'll just
the B. Someone was talking about BB.
Right, this is the Demacia version. Yeah, I just took this from his Mobalytics. Don't tell anybody.
We made this ourselves.
Yeah, this is mine.
Yep. Like any good card player, we changed 3 cards in the deck, and now it's our deck.
Oh, I changed 0. I just copied and pasted
okay. Even
this.
like the real best card players, you change nothing, you do well within an event, and all of a sudden it's your deck.
It's happened to us time and time again, but we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about a little different version of it where you play, you would take out the Allegiance card, you really go for this solid Demacia value type of cards. I love the Genevieve in this deck, and I really loved Radiant Guardian as well. I think Radiant Guardian right now it just wins you matchups straight up. Really liking that. 1 Hush, check plus for me. No more of the bullshit card. Sounds good. Uh, just this version looks really solid. Very big fan of this list after looking
I
at
think
it.
this is even better versus aggro. You lose some of the tools that might be better versus control, like the ability to what was I going to say? You lose some of the cards that I feel like could be good versus control, like maybe what's the 2 cost spell that we just talked about?
You're talking about the invoke card.
Right, yeah, the invoke card, which if you're going to play that card, it's probably a card that's good against control, and I kind of see where it comes in. I've even seen versions of
Well, that's
this
what I'm
that have
saying. That's why I said about Behold the Infinite. It seems like it could be a decent value card.
and I've seen versions of this deck that even play Lux over Aurelion Soul, and then they play like Remembrance. That's a deck I saw a few times the other day on ladder.
Yeah, we've
They play
seen a
like
switch up
Remembrance.
between Leona, Asol, and Lux. You could play any combination of the three.
Right, they were playing Lux over Asol as the win con. I
Right,
think
but I've also
Asol's
seen Lux
better.
Asol before.
Sure, I think you have to play Leona in this deck because it's just
I
Leona
think for the early
into
game, yeah.
Leona into Rayvoon is just an insane curve. That it's so hard to get through that, especially since she's probably evolved at that point. She's going to have guaranteed 2 of her 4 costs for fulfillment at that point. So I think really this deck really wants to have Aurelion Soul or Leona rather. And if you want to play Lux, I would cut the Aurelion Soul before I would cut Leona.
Yeah, and then just looking at this list because I meant to look at this, but I wanted to talk about it live because of we've seen a lot of variations of Leona Asol. I wanted to do that live, but I think this is the version that I much prefer over the older one that we saw before, the more value with just kind of meddling. It feels like you could take out those 5 allegiance cards and put in anything. Um, but I think that they both have merit, and it also depends on what. So I think that the Allegiance version for a tournament limited format is probably better because you can use whatever color you don't want to use, whatever region you don't want to use, and put that in as the tech cards. So that makes it more malleable. In this version, you have to play the Demacia is very integral to it. And another deck, the next one we're going to talk about, is a deck that also has a lot of variations that we've seen. Some are better than others, let's say, but we'll keep our opinions to ourselves. Not really. This is all about opinions. But this is the Inter list that I threw together, and it has a strong curve with the Bark Beast, the Omen Hawk. It plays the silly Cursed Keeper nonsense. You'll see that uh, it doesn't play Glimpse, and the reason is that I feel like the strongest parts about Endure is definitely just the unit vomit. You just want to the units on the board, and Stalking Shadows is more conducive to that because you get particular cards and it has no setup required. You just get them, and also Stalking Shadows with the Mist Wraith and the Wraithcaller. And I'll preface this by saying I'm very sold on Wraithcaller in terms of like I just want to get as wide as the board as popular. Mist Wraith, I don't know if that's getting too cute or not. If it's just not good, it makes it too clunky. Things of that nature. I'm not sure, but I think that I like in principle. I look at this deck list and it looks very nice to me. I like the cute little tech cards. Ravenous Butcher. Please don't play 3 this card. This card is so bad. This card only ever saw play because of Cursed Keeper, and it was necessary because we didn't have ways to proc Cursed Keeper. We have a much better card called Blighted Caretaker. This card is insane. This card is bad. Ravenous Butcher, bad. It's a necessary evil to certain extents, and it works in some instances, but in general, this card is not good. It has the nut hand with Bark Beast, Curse Keeper, Butcher, and it sometimes you just need a proc for your Curse Keeper, especially with no Glimpse from Beyond. But in general, Ravenous Butcher is a bad card. Do you agree?
Yeah, we've said since day one, the only time this card is ever good when you open it with Curse Keeper, and every other time it sucks. It has no merit whatsoever. And
It's
now that there's a
so
better
clunky.
yeah, now that there's a better enabler for Curse Keeper, it's now even more high roll. Like if you're gonna play like 2 or 3, you're just you're getting so much more into high roll territory. And Curse Keeper is a card that your deck already relies so heavily on. Why do you want to make it even more intense? Like, why do you want to make your deck rely even more on Curse Keeper than it already does? And it's already the most important card in the deck. So
Right, and I agree that the strength of this deck is definitely going one drop Cursed Keeper with the Blighted Caretaker. Any play with Cursed Keeper is your best line of play. However, my intention with this deck was to make it more balanced in the early game. We've seen the list that certain people are playing out there, let's say, doesn't play any other 2-drop than Cursed Keeper, and I think that that's insane because this is a tempo aggro deck. How do you only play 3 2-drops? Blows my mind. Anyway, but that's where the Mist Wraith came in, and it just the Wraith Caller is good. The Mist Wraith is a little cute. Let's say I think you could play Wraith Caller without the Mist Wraith, and that's not insane because of you would just treat Wraith Caller as a 4/3 that summons a 2/2, and that's a good card. But I like the Mist Wraith adds more. It adds more consistency to cards like Atrocity or even Callista because it enables them. It gives them things to do when it's not just, oh, Atrocity only works with Endure or Callista only works with like Wraithcaller or Curse Keeper, things like that. I like that it adds various plays and makes them more consistent, which is Endure is considered a really high roll deck often because of everybody thinks of, oh, you go Bark Beast, Curse Keeper, Blighted Caretaker, and that's the game. That's the ball game. But I like
ball game a lot of the
time. Absolutely. There's nothing in the game that stops that outside of very niche and few far between plays, and that's the strongest part about the deck. Granted, that's true. However, I think that that's just not what you want to do in a card game, to rely on something like that. If you're only hitting that X amount of the games, you want to have good alternatives. And this deck, to me, has good alternatives, this particular list. Other options, I put a 1 in Chronicler of the Ruin. I think this card is one of the weakest cards in the deck in terms of, like, if I needed to play a different card, because this card is... Chronicler of Ruin, while it sounds like it's cool all the time, it's like, oh, yeah, you get the Wraithcaller plays, you get the Curse Keeper plays, you get the Mist Wraith, you get, all these different, magical Christmas land type of plays. And yes, that does happen, and it can be cute, but at the same time, I would never bank on it. But I do like it in its one-of capacity. It could even be a little cute heal card in instances where it's like, oh, you thought you killed this? Well, it's back to full health. But yeah, other than that, I think this looks pretty standard. Only 2 Elise in this version because I feel like Elise, while she is strong and bolsters that early game, I really like Sejuani in this current metagame. Any thick unit, any mid-range early game unit, Sejuani just can pick apart these annoying pesky things. But other than that, do you have any thoughts about this particular list or other lists that you would like to see talked about?
The only thing I will add to this that wasn't really touched upon is the reason for the inclusion of Wraithcaller, and someone mentioned it in the chat. Cards like Hush and the now discoverable 1-cost Silence a Unit kind of destroy this deck. And because Targon is sort of all the rage right now, there's so many more outs to this deck now. So cards like Wraithcaller give you a second way to win the game, whereas before you didn't always have enough early game aggression and tempo to kind of close out the game without They Who Endure, or even Atrocity sometimes wasn't enough because you would only get them to like somewhere in the 10 to 13 life range, and if you couldn't pull off They Who Endure, you just couldn't win the game. But Wraithcaller gives you more aggro, especially with the Mist Wraiths, to kind of close out and get closer to a potential Atrocity play or just winning the game naturally without They Who Endure, now that it's not nearly as reliable. Or even with Neverglade Collector, you just need more options to win the game that isn't just play They Who Endure. If that doesn't kill them, Atrocity on the follow-up. So you just need something more than They Who Endure with all the outs that are now going around to it. And they also have like the slow spells too. It's not just the silences. They have Obliterate for 6. They have Sunbeam for 6 that silences. Targon just has every out in the world to deal with They Who Endure. So you really just need another way to actually be able to win the game now.
Right. It's definitely not, I'm going to, fiddle around the whole game and then drop a mega endure for lethal. I don't think that type of strategy is viable anymore. You really have to be fighting for that early to mid game, and then endure can put you in a situation where they have to make hard decisions. Like, I use this card that doesn't, a card like Hush, where it's like, oh, I did 3 mana play nothing. Well, that is really strong against endure. At least you're making them make decisions with their mana where they can't develop other things. And yeah, like I said, I think you just really have to play for the early to mid game instead of relying on a big endure.
I think that's all there is to be said about this deck.
Yeah,
I think
but
the TLDR of this deck is this deck isn't block until they who endure anymore. It's you have to do sometimes you're gonna have to do damage and try to win the game, play a real game of Runeterra.
yeah, you're no more drop endure and smile.
Right. Emote.
Braum emotes. Yeah.
Right.
There's some really, they've definitely upped the annoyance, I guess. I don't want to say toxicity, but there's some fucking annoying emotes in the LOR. Who's the fuckhead who's sipping the juice? That thing makes me want to punch.
The worst one. That's the absolute most powerful. I'm going to make a whole video about how they need to ban that emote. That's like the equivalent of sorry in Hearthstone.
Oh, that's like sorry mixed with Braum emotes. It is infuriating. Who is that? Lulu sipping the juice?
That's Lulu, I'm pretty sure, right?
Fuck Lulu.
Right. For me, it was always the most annoying one was the Lux giving the thumbs up with the goofy smile. But once that drink and sipping the juice one came out, oh, so infuriating. I hate that one so much.
Yeah, really just grinds the gears. But we're going to go to... It's really sad to look at the tier list so far, and outside of one deck, it's really just a lot of the same. But this is going in that same vein, a deck that has, especially on EU, and we'll talk about the next deck that has risen into the A tier for me at least, this is a TF Gangplank deck. This one is particularly on the early game. Some versions don't play the Saboteur. I think that that's a mistake because this deck really wants to hit a 1-drop, but even if, you don't hit a 1-drop, you still have a lot of good uses for your mana. Your spell mana, that is, with Make It Rains and even Pilfered Goods to really just get back into tempo because of the discounts and the plays you can make with Pilfered Goods potential. And even Death Sand is really strong. You get rid of blockers and still do damage. You proc your plunger cards. But yeah, this deck is really strong. And the next deck we're going to talk about is very similar to this deck in that they feel very much like Demacia decks in these curves, but then they also have some value cards or some nice spells for spot situations or just nice game enders with the burst and the reach. But this one plays a 1 of Faron. I think that's kind of silly. I don't really like Faron. I liked it in certain capacities for other decks, but I think that this deck is not trying to really play a Faron ever. Maybe there are like slow matchups where Faron is just what you need, but I think that there are better cards you could be playing. Do you feel any way about that?
4 8-drops is a lot, man. I never really feel any sort of way about 4 8-drops other than I think it's a little over the top. Like the only deck where I think it's acceptable to play 4 8-drops is TF Swain. And even then, the Riptide Rex is questionable because there's no warning shot, so it's sometimes hard to trigger it on 8. So I find this is, for a deck like this, especially a deck that's so aggressive in its burn, like a deck that really wants to just kind of like be aggressive and burn them out, 8 1-drops feels like a lot to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
I misspoke. 4 8-drops.
4 8-drops.
Yeah, 4 8-drops
right.
is just a lot to me.
But I do think this deck is, and maybe I'm framing it in the wrong way. Let's say you took out the Legion Saboteurs and just played some more not 1-drop cards, let's say. It would be more of like a mid-rangey aggressive deck where you wouldn't be relying so much on the ones, but I just feel 1-drops are so strong that you would always want to play a 1-drop. But yeah, despite the Faron, which Is it? What do you think? Let's just change that right now because I don't really. Do
I
I
would cut
want
a
to?
Pharaon and one other card to add 2 more 1-drops in. I think 8 1s is right where you want. You don't need the full 9. 8 is probably enough, so you can yank him out and cut something else that you're a little high on, and you can throw in either 2 of the fearsome spider. Yeah, probably 2 of the fearsome spiders where I
At
would leave
that
it.
point, would you transition into a deck that I also think is comparable to this deck, which is the MFGP deck?
Um, yeah, I think MFGP is better than this. I really don't like this deck personally. I think this is just a worst incarnation of like 4 other decks that already exist. Like, I think if you want to play something similar to this, I personally like the spider burn aggro a little bit better. This offers some late game, but I think you just don't eat that late game is unnecessary. Like, they should be dead most of the time before turn 8. Riptide Rex is a hard card not to play, but other than that, I just think this is a less efficient version of some decks that we already have in the meta right now.
I agree to a certain extent, and I talk about that a lot. Is when people get cute with other decks and they try and play decks that already exist, but like something else does it better. Um, so I do agree with you in that capacity. I would like to see what the because I know that I took 3 cards out for that. This deck plays a one of Noxian Guillotine and 2 Ravenous Flock. I guess if that's what you're going for, more of the control deck, maybe that's fine. So I'll just put it back in its original state, and then I'll put up a an MF GP deck because that's the deck that I like more. This feels like if you're gonna play the the Ravenous Fox and the Guillotine, that just feels like a not as good TF Swain deck. Um, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it feels like a not as good TF Swain deck. I feel like it feels like a not as good even like I'll even go as far as to compare it to a deck we're gonna talk about. I think it's the next one in the line actually is
Yeah.
Sejuani GP.
Yep.
I think it's not as good as the Burn Noxus Aggro Spiders. I think they're. I'm sure if I look through the list, I can find like another deck or two that I think this deck is just an inferior version of. If I want to really stretch, it's just an inferior Scouts.
Isn't every deck an inferior scouts?
Yeah, every creature based deck is just inferior Scouts. Yep.
So this deck is actually playing 2 Captain Pharaons at the top. I don't know how I feel about that. I think
I don't.
Riptide Rex is much better.
Every time I've lost to Captain Pharaon, they've had no cards in hand. There's no outs. It's their attack. They draw for turn. I have them dead to rights, and it's fucking Captain Pharaon, and I lose. That's been my experience with Captain Pharaon. So take
So
that
do
for
you
what you
think
will.
in that capacity the Captain Pharaon is more warranted in this list?
I think it's a one. I think it's a card you play as a one of.
2 of definitely seems wrong to me.
Yeah, 2 of's way too. I think it's a one of because it is just a card when you're down, you're out. Like you just need that little bit of reach. He provides you a whole lot of reach. He's like I don't want to go as far to say he's like the equivalent of Pyroblast for those of you that play Hearthstone, but he is almost like like somewhere between Fireball and Pyroblast in my mind.
Yeah, he definitely, especially when you can use your life in a way to buy you another turn or something. Okay, I just have more time to play Decimates. That's really strong, and I could see how your opponent is definitely playing defensively against a deck like this, where again we see this reoccurring theme of 9 1-drops. Already makes me love this deck. Um, but so it doesn't play the 2/3. What's the disciple? Do you think it should be playing that?
Which one is that?
The Crimson Disciple. It used to do 2 damage when it took a damage. Now it does 1.
Eh,
It's kind
I
of
don't think
weak.
that card is
Yeah.
very good anymore.
So what's a
It's just
one?
like
What's like a one of we can throw in this bad boy? It's pretty
uh
consistent. It's a lot of threes.
what's the current list? Let me pull it up real quick. Let me see it.
It's
Um
You're looking at the stream.
I,
Trying to
I
think
am
of a.
yeah, I'm looking at the stream right now. Is this the whole I'm trying to see the deck list itself.
Like,
because the screen doesn't show the deck list.
Oh, you're right, because it's too small right now.
Right, yeah, it's just showing me the card list. I like to look at everything before I recommend a card that's already in there, because I don't know every single
Okay.
card.
No, I didn't realize it was that, because I like to enlarge in the deck list when I'm looking at it, but it takes the things on the sides away, so I just linked it to you directly.
Okay, so the only thing that I would say maybe this deck wants is the 2/3 that gives a guy vulnerable. As much as it doesn't go with the flow of the deck, you against decks like Damasha, making that early trade, like taking a value trade on one of their guys early, can allow for you to get just an insane amount of tempo right off the bat. That's actually one of the what's called Dreadway Deckhand or something. No, that's the one that makes the barrel.
You're talking about Hired Gun.
Hired Gun, thank you. Yes. Hired Gun is a card, especially versus decks like Scouts, where you can take a value trade right away and it sets you so far ahead, especially when it's on something like, say, Fleet Feather Tracker, where they are really relying on that to try to take one of your more aggressive cards off the board, or something like maybe Zap Sprayfin, for example. It's just, it doesn't go with the flow of the deck well, but I still think it's a very good card.
Yeah, absolutely. And it says it in our fucking bio. I am reading what you said in Ochre. Your dad's not going to kick you out of the house for raising gamer.
You might actually. With you, Invoker. If your priorities are getting master, your dad should kick you out of the house.
Also, you're sending me this trash. Please do not send me fucking Yasuo Darius.
We talked about this.
we talked about this, young man.
We talked about this deck as a spoof. We're like, what's a deck that we could try to get to like just the craziest deck we could think of, and we're like, what about Darius Yasuo with the detain, or not detain, what's the card called, the 2 cost,
Apprehend, that's the name of it.
Yeah, with Apprehend, we like kind of joked about that. So once again, Apprehend is a card I want to talk about a little bit at the end of the stream, but we'll wait till we'll
get to that later.
You're right.
So we talked about this deck. Yep. Let's see, what else we have in that big old A tier? Not a lot. Just trying to think of... Oh, we didn't talk about... Of course. You distracted me. This is your fault. Where's that fucking GP deck? I know I uploaded one. Oh, there it is. There you are. Alright, GP Sejuani. Very similar to the TF Swain or TF GP deck that we were looking at earlier, but I do like this deck more. People seem really on board with this Prowling Cutthroat. I don't think it's bad. I don't think it's great. I'll
say it's bad. I think it's bad. I don't understand what.
Why aren't decks playing Omen Hawk? Why aren't these decks playing Omen Hawk?
They want to make their Grifter more consistent. They don't
really
want to play
that's
9. It. I guess. I don't know. I think Prowling Cutthroat sucks dick. Like, I think this card is.
I think this card is a little too weak for me. It's not atrocious, but I don't think it's good enough to see play in Constructed, really. I see how it's like a plunder activator sometimes. This deck doesn't really have that many plunger triggers, though.
I think this card is...
Is it because you really just want to get GP Sejuani leveled up all the time? I don't think that's much of a problem, right?
I think this deck puts too much emphasis on trying to level Gangplank Sejuani, and maybe that's because that's all this deck can do. Like, Monkey Business sucks. Why do people like, you get 2 fulfillments? Like, whoa.
We're definitely making a few changes. Monkey Business is... that card's coming out faster than you can say out.
Right.
That card... So
something that makes me mad is that Tempo Storm, for those of you who are familiar, they released their tier list, and they had this deck number 2 right below TF Swain, and had the audacity to put Scouts as B tier. But this deck is at the top of A tier. Really makes my blood boil.
Don't try to understand them. Just
Yeah,
rope, and band them. However,
I don't know much about them other than they were big in Hearthstone, but God, it makes my blood boil to see this deck at the top. When I have probably played this deck twice on ladder, and it was just, I don't want to say a flaming pile of dog shit, but I would say it was just, it wasn't much better than a regular pile of dog shit.
I
Not
don't want to
quite on
change
fire,
too
but
much with this deck because I want to bring up, I think, a deck that's better than this, which is going to be the MF GP or MF Sejuani deck. I think that deck is better, but I cannot stand that this card is in there, the monkey business. So I'm trying to think of another card to put in.
yeah. I have like a 5-step guide to determining if the deck you're playing against is bad. And typically the first step is, does it play Monkey Idol? That's the first check on the list. Yep, okay, check. The next one is like, does it play Prankster? Okay, check. Does it play both Prankster and Monkey Idol? That's the third check. So where I'm going with that though is I do not think Monkey Idol is a very good card. I think it saw 0 play when it was 4 health, right? It was 4 health before, right?
Right.
And I think it's one of those cards that there's something I talk about all the time where cards get buffed and people think, I think what happens is people think they're better, so they get played a lot, and then people post deck lists with them, and then that causes the cards to get played a lot more, but they're not necessarily that much better than they were before. It's kind of like a psychological thing where they buff them, so you just think they're better, and that causes you play them, so other people play them, and then more people play them, and then eventually the card is just stuck in the meta because people have been playing it for so long. And I think Monkey Idol is a prime example of one of those cards that got buffed and kind of pulled the wool over everyone's eyes, pulled the Kaiser Soze, if you will, in making you think that it was real.
Yeah, there's a problem with the copy pasta in Legends of Runeterra, and people not really understanding why cards are played in certain capacities, and I think that is one of them. I just don't think that card is good. I don't think it's a good card. Is that wrong of me?
I remember, I don't remember who, but there was a streamer when that card first got buffed. I queued into him on day 1 like a couple times, and he was playing Chain Vest Monkey Idol, and oh man, that was, well, bad doesn't even begin to describe.
So we're gonna put up an old classic MF. Why can't I think of Sejuani? Yes, I think that this deck is just really solid right now, and it always has. Like, this deck never really stopped being good. People simply stopped playing it.
Yep, this deck
So
hasn't
we'll look
really
at this.
this deck never got nerfed in any way. Like nothing in it ever got touched to my knowledge.
Well,
right?
the plunder cards, the nap, however you want to categorize them, definitely got touched.
Another one of those. It got nerfed, so it must be bad. Let's stop playing it. And I think to an extent, making it cost 3 made it. Yes, it did objectively make it worse, but I think that that wasn't enough to make this deck not good. I think this deck is still a
it
very
fell out of
fine
favor.
deck.
I think that is what happened more so than. Do you know Shieldbreaker? Yes, the card is bad. Can Braum Anivia ever work? I think that Anivia I think you would just play. We're gonna talk about that deck later, but at that point you would just play any Shadow Isles Freyr deck because there's a lot of them. Braum and Anivia are both not cutting it right now.
And then if you're going to go that far and play a control deck, just play Targon because it's just the superior control.
Right. Deck. If you're going that far, I think for ladder and tournament, depending on what's popular, Shadow Isles Frey can be pretty good. I know the deck that I took, I believe, is Shihu's deck, and he was ripping ass with that deck. He was just killing everybody with it. So I think that it does have a place, but for what you want, if you just really want to play the best control deck, if you really want to play the best Shadow Isles Frey deck, it would just never have Braum nor Anivia. And that whole deck that we used to know it as is not there. even if you wanted to play something similarly, like how it used to play, I would play Spooky Ash instead. I think that Ash Thresh is much better than an Ash or than an Anivia Braum deck.
Um, yeah, I would say so too. I mean, Ash Thresh is kind of an old deck we haven't seen in a while. I'm curious to see how it
Right, but I
fares.
think
But
I think it fits the mold of just people get bored of decks, especially the decks that
yeah,
aren't just like world break. But we've even seen that before. Like people didn't play Heimer, even when it was at its apex. People didn't play Heimer. They just didn't want to play it. We've seen people still in this day and age, and it's crazy that people don't want to play Scouts still. Just like a bunch of stuff that we've seen consistently, people refuse to play simply because it's boring, quote unquote. Which, yeah,
boring or brainless. I understand the attachment to, and I'm there with you a little bit. Like people don't want to play brainless decks, especially people who are better players or people who think they're better players. They want to. They don't want to be the I don't play brainless decks. You just play brainless idiot decks. Like I play high IQ control decks or whatever. Blah blah blah. But like there's no reason to be a snooty asshole. Like if a deck has a 70% win rate or
if it's
whatever the
good, it's
win rate
good.
is, yeah, if it's good, it's good. Like if you want to play a control deck and a control deck's good, go for it. But if all the control decks are tier B and you're trying to rank up and you're sitting there complaining, oh, why can't I win? Aggro's too broken. Yeah, maybe it is, but just play the aggro decks. Like don't sit there and kill yourself trying to play this game because you want to prove to I don't even know who. You don't want your dad to kick you out of the house because you can't win with control decks. Um,
Yeah, I think that people do get much caught up in like this atmosphere of like I want to play these cards because of particular reasons instead of just oh these decks are good, let me play them. Just that it goes back to the copy pasta sort of
yeah,
mindset that we
right,
see a lot.
right. And you're not playing at locals, guys. There's no one to show off for unless you're like a streamer or something. If you're playing on your own, nobody cares that you're an aggro player. Nobody's gonna be like, oh, he's the brainless aggro player. Just play the best deck, guys. Like if you want to have fun, then play a fun deck. But it, I think the idea of I don't want to play that deck because it's brainless is kind of just it's kind of like I don't want to single out any types of player, but it almost feels like a Magic player mentality to me.
Yeah, very much caught up in like the zeitgeist of things and the hype. What do you think about this deck that I threw together? Just a few alterations here. I put in Jack the Winner. I like Jack the Winner especially in this capacity because you get to have that strong 5 drop that GP would offer. However, you get to play A, he has a better stat line, but B, you get Misfortune, which I think is the more important part. And Misfortune is broken. Misfortune is one of the best champions in the game, and that makes me really want to play this version as opposed to with the GP.
Yeah, I think Misfortune is insane. Even more so when you have Challenger guys, which you don't really. You have like Sedge to give vulnerable. You have the hired gun to give vulnerable. You don't have as many Challenger guys as I would like, but you still have on top of Misfortune already being broken, you still have something there. I think this deck didn't ever stop being good, honestly. This was it was an S tier deck at the time of Heimer's reign. And I know it was one of the few decks that actually could beat Heimer somewhat consistently. I just haven't played against it or with it enough as of recent to really know what like how high it gets. Like, is this a high B tier deck? Is it a low A tier? Is it a high A tier? I don't want to say it's an S tier because I feel like we know about it already, but you never know. It really could be something. I just don't know where it falls, honestly.
So I know I really want to play Jack. Is the Scout guy better that gives vulnerable?
I think he's better. I personally like him, especially when you're playing things like Misfortune, where you can go curve Misfortune on 3 when you attack,
Yeah.
curve the Scout guy on 5 with attack, vulnerable. What does he? You choose the vulnerable, or does he give you some strong?
Nope, you get to choose.
Yeah, yeah. So you go vulnerable on the 1 health guy. Okay, Scout, grab it, kill it for free. Now attack again. It
Really
feels very
strong.
yeah, it feels much stronger. Especially this deck does 2 things. It's a mid range deck, so it can control or it can burn. But Jack the Winner is well statted as he is. he's more of an aggressive card than he is like a control card, and I think this card fits the niche a little bit better, where he kind of does both, whereas Jack the Ripper or Jack the Winner only does one thing. So
Jack the Stripper.
Yeah, Jack the Stripper only does. Razor Scale fits both the control and aggro role, whereas Jack the Stripper is only more of an aggro card, in my opinion. An aggro card with a lot of health, but I just don't
so
think
after
he's good.
updating this deck, I took out the what's it called, the what's that, Fury of the North. I took out Fury of the North. I put in Troll Chance. I feel like Troll Chance, especially for its mana in a deck like this, is much more reasonable.
You can make Fury of the North if you have multiple Sedge in hand.
Yeah,
like if you have
I think that's pretty hard to do, especially given Sejuani's cost. It's not. I like that reasoning in a lot of other applications for champ spells, but Sejuani, unfortunately, I think is too expensive for that combat trick. But Razor Scale Hunter with Misfortune just feels so much better in this deck to me. And then Troll Chant, as I said, I think Troll Chant is, for its mana, the best combat trick in the game. I'm willing to go out on that limb. It's just so efficient. So I'm looking at this deck and it just looks really strong to me. Any alteration?
Someone redeemed a song request, "In the Air Tonight" by Phil Collins.
Okay, I'm listening to it right now. I'm listening in my head.
Okay. All right, we'll all listen to it in our heads for you.
Yes. Any last changes you want to make to this deck before we move on? Because I think after this we're sinking into the B tier, because there's a lot of these decks and I don't know which ones are better than others.
I'm all set with this deck. I have nothing to say.
Yeah, so we're gonna move on to what's first here. No, these aren't my decks. These are other people's decks. Don't look at them. Nobody else makes decks in this game. Let's look at Ezreal, a deck that really got hyped, like mega hyped, coming into day one of Call of the Mountain. I'm really not sure about the deck list I have here. It feels like it's just a really bad Karma deck because of how slow it is. But I do like Vi. I like the interaction with the gems. I think it has a pretty reasonable early game against the decks that we're seeing. It has some removal tools. I'm not sure about how good this deck is, though.
I don't have a strong opinion on it right now. I will just say it remains to be seen. And I think there's some synergy with Vi and the gems and Ezreal. And we talked about how with Shards of the Mountain, if you have 13 mana and evolved Ezreal, it's a perfect lethal, assuming that you can create at least 9 gems in hand. So it's 2 and then 9 gems. So that's exactly 20 damage with the Shards of the Mountain, assuming you can make 9. But I don't know. I think it's going to be hard to beat Karma Ezreal. I think it's hard to justify.
Yeah, for what it's doing, I do think that it's just simply inferior to that deck.
Yeah. I have not much to say about this other than I just haven't seen enough of this deck to know what its full potential is. But for right now, I think B tier is pretty fitting.
Yeah, I think its biggest potential will not be on ladder. It will be in tournament, to use the colors properly if you want to use Ionia in another capacity. But unfortunately, we've just seen Ionia as not that strong in tournament format, nor ladder. So really don't know what to do about Ezreal or an Ezreal Targon deck. I really don't feel it's there. A deck I know that you're a big fan of, and this is Zero's list, friend of the show, and
so this is probably the only thing we disagree on. I think this is an A tier deck. I like this deck, and when I say like it, I mean I think it's a good deck. I actually hate this deck. If you play this deck, I think your dad should kick you out of the house. This deck
should be kicking you out of the house left and right for playing this deck.
Yeah, it's like when your dad comes and he's like, "Are you winning, son?" And you're like, "Yeah, Dad, I'm winning." And he's like, "Oh, you're playing Jinx Draven. Like, get the fuck out of my house." This deck is
Yeah.
just absolute cancer. And the only thing I personally think holds it back from S tier in my mind is that the entire deck revolves around seeing Jinx or it sucks.
Yeah, and not only Jinx. So something a general archetype I dislike in Legends of Runeterra is decks that revolve around champions but don't actually have ways to protect them. And we've seen a lot of them throughout the game's history. So think of like I guess Ez Karma is one of the few ones where that's okay because you just don't run your champions out. But we've seen decks like a Jinx deck or even like a
Yasuo.
right, Yasuo, Heimer decks, Heimer without Ionia, uh, but just like decks that are fragile when you need your champion to live, but don't actually play ways to save it. Really weak, and this deck in particular makes me furious to play against because of how high rolly it is, and that high roll is really good. But I think it's just too inconsistent when looking at other decks. Like if I was playing a burn deck, I would much rather play MFGP or something in that similar vein, a Bilgewater Noxus deck as opposed to this deck.
Yeah, I will say I've played against this enough to feel like I think this is B tier. Just always see Jinx in the first 4 turns of the game, and I'm pretty sure you'll win. That's really all I have to say about this. I think Augmented Experimenter is the how do I put this without getting banned from Twitch?
The Rager.
That card that is probably the most rage-inducing card for me in Legends of Runeterra. I cannot fucking stand when my opponent plays that card on me. It is so fucking stupid. I cannot emphasize enough how much I fucking hate Augmented Experimenter. Day one, the day Legends of Runeterra came out, someone was playing this deck and they casted that card against me, and the first thing I said was, "What the fuck? They need to nerf this card."
Yeah, this deck definitely. If you've never seen a card game before and you wonder what the word top deck means, this deck has many deadly top decks. Whether it's the burn cards or a Jinx or an Augmented Experimenter, very frustrating. And granted, it plays itself in situations to top deck, but it's still you're banking on top decking cards quite often.
So there's let's move on before I give myself a fucking aneurysm.
Another deck that I also hate, Deep. I think Deep is a deck that people definitely forgot about. It got swept away in the madness of the new set, and people really excited about the new cards. But I think it's solid. I never liked this deck in particular, but I recognize that it has decent lines and matchups. Devour the Depths, I think, is what really keeps this deck together because of how strong that card is. In certain matchups, it could just really play into that Shadow Isles defensive package. Nautilus, Maokai, both really strong champions. Maokai can win certain controlled matchups. I haven't really played Maokai since the new set. I don't know if that type of play is that like playable now, where it's like I'll just use Maokai against really slow decks. Is Asol just too good for that?
I don't even know, man. I'm not a great person to ask about this deck. I've always had a personal bias against this deck because I've never felt this deck was good. Even when this deck was like in the top decks, I thought this deck was bad. I've played with this deck. I've played against this deck. I've never ever been impressed by this deck in any capacity. I've always thought it was just like a bad control deck, sort of like I don't even want to call it like a control deck, but I guess it's like a mid-range control deck, and I've just always thought this deck was bad. So maybe I'm not the best person to ask about
I
it.
think it definitely shines more in a limited format, like a tournament format, where you're trying to make the best use of colors, because it just does have really strong bombs. But yeah, in general,
if you don't fulfill or see Maokai like right on turn 7, it's terrible. Actually, I can tell you about a game I played on stream.
Nautilus.
Sorry, Nautilus, my bad. I can tell you on stream I played just the other day. I played Liquid Hyped. He on turn 7, he was at 15 cards. All he has to do is play Maokai and then just vomit his hand. I know he's got at least 2 or 3 sea monsters in hand because he casted 2 of the card that finds them and reduces them. All he has to do is play Maokai, and while it is very unlikely that this happens, for the next 3 turns, he just didn't find Maokai, or yeah, not Maokai, sorry, Nautilus. He didn't find Nautilus, and I just bodied him. He had everything
Yeah,
going.
this deck is definitely you play Nautilus and just vomit infinite Devour of the Depths.
Right. He got down to like I think 6 cards in deck, and just bad luck. Didn't find Nautilus, and those sea monsters just unless they're being played for 4 less than their cost, they're just not good.
And I know amongst the best players in the game, this deck is very much maligned. Everybody dislikes this deck because of how it is one of the most linear decks in the game. You're really just playing things to go deep, and then you play the Nautilus, and you play... It's really boring to play, and not very stimulating in terms of gameplay and decision-making. One new addition to talk about before we move on is Stalking Shadows. I put a 2 of Stalking Shadows in this deck because I think it has a lot of synergy with the deep cards. Like, if you just want a turbo deep with Dredgers, or if you really want value with something where the ephemeral part doesn't matter, like a Devourer of the Depths, I think that's really strong. Even Jaw Hunters, getting like an ephemeral Jaw Hunters, getting many copies of Jaw Hunters can be really strong against mid-range and Demacia decks. So I'm a fan of that in this deck. But other than that, this deck is pretty run-of-the-mill. We've seen this deck so much, and it's really never been great. I know people really liked it in certain patches. The one that sticks out to me, I think, was patch 1.4, where people really thought it was in that S tier with Heimer and MF Sejuani, and it was clearly a step, if not 2 steps below.
Right, and I don't know. I just don't have anything positive to say about Deep. I don't think it's a very good deck. I think, like you said, it's very linear. It wants to do only one thing, and even when it does the one thing it wants to do, it still doesn't always win. So,
yeah. Here's a deck that we see. I think this deck is still really popular. I know this is the deck that Nick Makes Plays used to get to Master first. I think he was the 4th Master. And he might have... he got rank 1 this season, I'm sure, so I'll even just say this deck. Yeah, I think he probably got rank 1 with this deck. Putting it out on the line, sue me. But a deck that I'm just really not that high on, personally, and I like... We'll talk about the 3 1-drops again, or the 9 1-drops again. Really solid opener against a lot of decks. I still think this deck is just like an inferior Bannerman Scouts type of deck. I think it's cute, and it has like some fun plays to do with like huge Nocturne. You can't block my boards, and Diana sometimes gets there in the early game as like a really good counter, even like against a deck that is faster than this. Even though this deck is supposed to be really fast, it plays 9 1-drops. I really just don't like Nightfall in a mechanic. Period. I think it's really clunky, and there's not a good way to play it. But I do think that this deck is still a good deck. For my money, I would just play a different, more consistent deck, though. How do you feel about Diana Nocturne? I'm sure you played against it a ton on ladder.
I'm sure wherever Nick Makes Plays is right now, his like spider sense is tingling. Like someone is making fun of Diana.
I'm not making fun of it.
Someone is underrating this deck. Like
there's an injustice in the cosmos.
Right. I'm sure if he was in here right now, he'd tell us all about it. He'd like join the call and be like, no, let me tell you about why this deck is good. But no, I mean, whether it's good or bad, he's a very solid player.
He's gotten rank 1 every season.
You're right. The guy is obviously... He's a good player, whether that's because he's just a god at the game, or he has really good deck choices, or because he just plays a lot, or a combination.
Oh no, I don't. I think if you get rank 1 every season, you're doing something right. And this deck is a solid deck, like I said. I just think that other decks do what it does, but better and more consistent. And Scouts is the one that sticks out to me.
I'll give it the A tier. I have faith in Nick Makes Plays. I've watched him stream enough that I've seen this deck play. I've seen what it can do, and I truly believe that this deck could be A tier. I won't go as far to say it's S tier because I'm pretty stuck in my ways about but I think this is high A tier, and maybe when Nick makes plays it, it's S tier. But I would say for you Joe Schmoes out there, this is what I would consider an A tier deck.
I want to change it to A because it seems more appropriate, but I really just don't. I don't see it. I think that this deck is like, it's good because it's doing the right things, but the right things are just in a much better application in other decks like Scouts. And its advantage over Scouts would be that it has some value, it has some reach, it has like a few things going for it, but overall, its power level is not close to Scouts, where you talk about a card like Genevieve. This guy is a joke compared to Genevieve. You got all these spells, you're not curving like a real aggro unit-based deck wants to do. All these cards are conditional. Like, if your one drop is this card, the Stygian Onlooker, that feels really weak. It also really falls victim to any form of like cards that would negate, or not negate's not the right word, but like Vile Feast can
cancel
do some
out or trade.
Right. Avalanche, while Avalanche can be strong against Scouts, at least there's counterplay in Scouts, and sometimes you could even make a deck that's thick enough where one Avalanche isn't good enough. I feel like a Withering Wail just blows this deck into smithereens. So make the case for the A tier just because it's like performing okay.
I feel like we get stuck in this here at Meta World Gaming. We only have 3 decks this meta. They are Control, Scouts, and Bad Scouts, and every deck falls under one of those 3 tiers. And I think we're caught up too much on the. I think sometimes we get caught up too much on the. This is just Bad Scouts because of our favoritism.
Oh, absolutely.
And I'm sure if you asked, maybe, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I'm sure if you asked Nick Makes Plays, he'd be like, yeah, Scouts is just bad, Diana Nocturne. So
maybe there's something to that. Okay.
But
you know what? Out of respect for Nick Makes Plays and how much influence this deck has had, I will put it into the A tier because I do think I see how this deck is good, and I honestly have not played many games with, nor I guess I've played a lot of games against it, but mostly as Scouts. But I just think I don't like clunky decks. I think that especially in a game where we're centering around ladder play, you're looking for the most consistent best decks, not just like this deck when it goes off, because you're playing a ton of games. So you're just looking for what performs the best over a large sample size, not like the high rolls.
Right. I said that actually the beginning, Denny, where we we went from the Heimer channel to the Scouts channel, and man, I just explained it too. I hate to be like I hate to go from such a high IQ deck to such a low IQ deck, but we don't want to get caught up on too much on this is a brainless deck, and we're not going to play it because it's brainless. This is the best deck, and we're going to play it because it's the best deck. Heimer was the best deck, and yes, it was a high IQ deck, but we played it they played it because it was it was the best deck, not because it was a high IQ deck. It just also happened to be a big brain deck.
Yeah, we've always just been about we're going to play the best deck. It doesn't matter if it's smart or if it's very taxing intelligence-wise or skill-wise. Doesn't matter. I'm going to play it because it's good. And this is a deck that we've really seen fall off in terms of not only play, but also just win percentages. And I think we've just made better Asol decks now. And that's this Trundle Asol deck with all the ramp and things like that. This deck seems like it really just lost a step. Why do you think that is?
People are playing other decks, I guess. I haven't seen it too much on ladder this week. Although I think Glop still has a pretty high win rate with it. I can't say for certain because I haven't looked at it, but I remember he did have a pretty high win rate with it. I don't watch him, so I don't know if he still plays it, but I'm guessing he does. Um, I don't know why this deck fell out of favor. This felt like almost an S tier pushing deck. I would still put this in A tier. I think B tier is still a little harsh on this deck. I would say this is definitely still an A tier deck. We're just seeing it played less, but I don't really know why.
So my theory is that this deck is really not good against a lot of the aggro decks that we see. It has tools, but they're few and far between. And the type of decks, especially like Scouts just murders this deck.
Yeah, if you don't see so okay, it's not that serious a lot of the time, but if you don't see Avalanche or they see Rangers Resolve, you are gonna get murdered. Now, the variants that do better against Scouts, when you play both Avalanche and the what's the Icequake or whatever, when you play both
Mm-hmm.
Avalanche and Icequake, I think that swings their favor significantly because there's no way to stop Icequake. Like if they have 3 mana banking into turn 5 and they play Icequake, it's really hard as a Scouts player to come back, especially if they had like an Avalanche before that. But if you don't have both of those and you either don't see Avalanche or they see Rangers Resolve and you only see one Avalanche, they're going to murder you. Like it's going to be pretty brutal, especially since you have to curve Trundle on 5. You probably have to ramp into Trundle too, and you have to have Avalanche. There's a lot of things that need to go right for you for this to really work out in your favor. And just something as like you don't curve properly, you don't see Avalanche, they see Rangers Resolve it can just be backbreaking for you. So
Yeah,
I don't
absolutely.
I don't think this is as bad matched up as Scouts as um it may seem at first glance, but I do think that Scouts is most certainly favored versus this deck.
And Denny QQ brings up a good point. I think it is because we just see a lot of unit heavy decks, and ramp is very bad against unit heavy decks because you play a Catalyst of Aeons for 5 mana, I played a 5 mana unit, you're getting your teeth knocked out. Or like you play a Wording Stones, I played actual units. It really doesn't line up well for you.
So the problem with adding Icequake, Pandatone or Pandatown,
It's bad in
is
everything
that
else.
you're right. If you play against a control deck, now you have 3 extra bricks in your deck. On top of the fact that you already have 3 avalanches, so you just add all these bricks into your deck. Trundle also becomes Icequake, so now you have a champion spell that's useless too. So if you play like another Asol deck or some type of control deck, which is also going to be some type of Targon deck, you just add so many more bricks into your deck that you don't want there. It's an 8 mana spell that's going to be very hard to cast, I imagine.
Yeah, so I feel unlike Diana Nocturne, I could be convinced to put it into A tier. I feel very strongly about this deck staying in B tier because I don't think it's that good. I
No,
think we have.
Oh, sorry.
I think we've already seen better Asol decks.
You can't switch Avalanche for Icequake. Avalanche comes down too soon, and that's what stops early game aggression. Like
Oh,
Avalanche,
absolutely.
Avalanche can be a blowout for Scouts too, especially when their curve is a lot of ones, which all have 2 health or less. That's where it really shines. You can't get rid of Avalanche. You have to 100% be playing Avalanche because if you don't play Avalanche or something to stop them, by the time you hit turn 5, especially since you have to have 3 mana banked, you probably already dead. Like if you have to play that, they don't even have to take initiative. So you just go wipe their board. Okay, they play more dudes. If you did it on their turn, they're going to play more dudes before the open. And if you did it on their turn, they're just going to play a dude and then attack with the dude after you already Icequake. So I just don't think it's you would ever swap. You either play both or just Avalanche.
Yeah, and a deck in the same vein of this, the 9 1-drops, we've seen Spiders come back somehow because of how good 1-drops are, how good early aggression is, and I think this deck is pretty solid. I would put this at the top of B tier if I was to really rearrange A, B, and S in terms of like the decks themselves. I think this deck is really solid.
I think this is an A tier deck, like even a mid A tier deck. I'm a little more, I'm a little less harsh on deck criticisms, I guess, than Juggernaut is here. But I've played against this deck quite a few times now. I know Zulu was playing this deck today. For those of you who don't know, he was the guy who was like High Master last season. He might have even finished in first or close to it, but I saw he was playing this deck. I know Swim was playing some variant of it. But I have played against this deck a few times in the last couple days, and I think this deck is pretty good and finds its way into A tier. I've been impressed with this deck, but it definitely does fall into the category of bad scouts.
I think what I dislike about this deck is how fragile it is.
If where it goes wrong for this deck is if your early game doesn't go well because you don't have a late game like Darius or the spider that pumps all your other spiders or the arena champ, it's just over. Like you have to curve in the early game, or it's going to be, especially against an aggressive deck, you're just going to get blown out. But when you do curve well in the early, like you go one into, say, Elise into Skitterer, and you just get that little bit of damage. You only need a little, in my experience. Maybe like somewhere in the 7 to 10 range of damage. You can just easily finish them off with burn from there. You just have even all your creatures double as burn for the most part. You have all the spells that do burn. So you only need a little bit of damage in the early game. The problems just come when your first 3 turns are just ass and you're playing against an aggressive deck and there's just no way to ever make up for lost time.
Right, and obviously all early game decks, if you just match their early game, it goes poorly for them. But I think that the reason that I think that this is worse than the other ones is because of how easily it's stopped with a lot of just like fragile units. And it has good burn capacity, but we've seen there wasn't a lot of new burn. Actually, was there any new, significant new burn cards? But there's been a lot of new healing cards.
No. Yeah, and the popular one is what's petting the guy petting the thing? What guiding touch? Thank you.
Guiding touch. There's just like a lot of new the celestial card everybody plays.
Right. Guiding touch, I think, is the big one for decks like this because it's so cheap. It's like the successor of Health Potion, where it just throws off lethals very easily. They can play it on turns where they have nothing else to do and not feel bad because it still filters. So if they're going to burn mana, they just play it and they filter. And against a deck like this, they don't even feel bad because they got their health back. It's just overall, it's a very, very solid card. And right, you have Celestial Healing and all these other cards like the Silver Sister or the Golden Sister that has Life Steal. So there are just a lot of ways to kind of combat burn now.
So one change I'm thinking while looking at this deck is I think that Vile Feast is better than Unspeakable Horror.
So I think in this deck, one of the reasons you want Unspeakable Horror, and the only reason I agree with it in this deck, besides obviously getting a body, a lot of which are actual burn creatures, is it hits face. And that 1 damage can be very important sometimes in this deck.
I think the spider usually gets that 1 damage though, and it also synergizes with the Elise better. I really just think it's better in here.
I just think the creature, a lot of these dust creatures are so you have the one that gives itself elusive, you have the one that gives another guy elusive, you have the one that does 2 damage. A lot of these guys, you have the one that has overwhelm. A lot of these guys provide some form of burn. So I think you're just going to generate more damage. And this is one of the very few decks where I would probably play Unspeakable Horror over Vile Feast just because all the creatures it generates are burn guys, and it itself is a burn card.
Okay, I can actually agree to that. I can agree with that line of thinking. I guess the Elise is just it's never flipping, so that's not even worth talking about. But I do, in general, I dislike in general the argument that it goes face because I think a 1/1 spider generally can get you that 1 damage. But
sure.
I think the Nightfall card might be able to provide more value.
You have like how many Nightfall cards? So it finds a random Nightfall card. Can it find itself? Do we know that?
I believe I think they took that idea out of the game. It can't find itself.
Okay, so almost every nightfall, not every, but you have like 5 nightfall cards that are make some form of burn, and then like one replaces itself. One's the pump and draw, and that's pseudo damage, right? If a guy's going through, you can pump it. So you have all these cards that are very conducive to your aggressive strategy. Even like
Right.
you, at worst, you get what, Stygian Onlooker. He's still a 4/1 with fearsome.
Right.
That's acceptable. So I think that this is one of the few decks where I like Unspeakable Horror just a little bit more than I do Vile Feast.
Yeah, I can agree to that. I think, like I said about how fragile this is, Bilgewater is really strong right now, and I think Bilgewater absolutely dumpsters a deck like this. So that's why I'm keeping it in B tier, and I don't feel swayed to put it into A.
Hmm.
We're going to talk about an old deck, Warmother Control.
Oh,
It's been
baby.
retooled a little bit with Trundle. I personally think that Warmother's generally bad, but people have been doing okay with it. It has tools here that really would be trying to stop all these aggressive unit based decks. However, I still think it's like pretty inconsistent in that endeavor, and also even when you even when it all goes right for you, it's still not that great. Like, I don't think it's like that strong, and it gets beat by the better like the better control decks, like a more classic Asol deck, because of the value it provides. But you can also tempo out with the War Mothers and Atrocity and Tryndamere and things like that. So I think this deck is pretty
I
solid.
My argument here, and I'll just make this pretty quick for me. Why would I ever play this when I could just play a Targon deck? I don't see this ever being better than any Targon deck that exists. And the only reason I would personally ever play a deck like this is if I wanted to play something cool for my stream that day. There's no reason to play this deck unless you really enjoy playing it. There are, in my opinion, strictly superior versions of this deck that exist. This is just bad Asol. That's what I'll call this. I don't like this deck. I don't think it's good. I just think it's outdated, and it's not a deck that I would play unless I was trying to earn style points or I was for some reason really attached to it, which I hope none of you are.
I think sometimes it can be better against mid-rangey decks because of Trundle and Hearthguard, but also with, like, if you think Withering Wail is really strong in matchups, or Vengeance, the Drain cards, I think it has some different things going for it. I do think the War Mother in general is just a 12 mana spell,
Yeah,
really hard to play.
it's
But I don't think it's bad. I think it's only okay though. A deck that we talked about last week hasn't changed a lot. I had it in A last week. It felt a little better against the Asol decks. Now we're seeing Asol not as popular, or at least we see more early game Asol decks. Uh, and then just the good old Scouts pummels this deck. But it's still good deck. It's a great tournament deck. But yeah, not a lot to say about it in general.
yeah. I mean, you know what this deck does.
Right, it's been doing the
If
same
you're
thing for a while.
Yeah, if you're new to the game, I mean, I don't want to I don't want to cut this short for you, but there's plenty of info out there where you can figure out where this deck does pretty easily. We still have a few more decks to go over, and I don't want to waste too much time talking about a deck that has existed for
Yeah,
quite some
and I'm gonna just breeze through the next few because they're all similar. TFS is just like, we've seen this deck before. It's still good. It's not a world beater like it was many moons ago, but it's still a good deck. Um, I think this version in general, maybe, I guess Thermal Beam isn't as strong anymore because of Spell Shield, which matters in a good amount of situations, unfortunately, because I like Thermo Beam. But this deck just like, seems really solid. I don't want to waste time on it. Another deck I just don't want to waste time on, and I heard somebody talk about it before, is Ash Sejuani. Yes, this deck is still pretty solid. It got a little worse with Trifarian Assessors, mana increase. However, I still think that this deck It's simply just a really solid, a never deck that I personally want to play, but I recognize its power. It feels inconsistent and clunky. That's because it is. Uh, One notable thing talking about it is that Reckoning right now is really, really good, and I'm surprised a lot of people don't play this deck more because of how good Reckoning is to the current meta. But I guess that's just, we'll see how it goes. Maybe people will adapt. I'm trying to think if there's any more B tier decks to really just breeze over. Uh, okay, we can talk about Lulu Shen because there's actually things to talk about because it's new. So
And
this is,
people are attached. People think this is better than Scouts.
yeah, people really do like this deck, and personally,
This is a high roll deck.
yeah, and I like the Shen or the Zed version better. I couldn't really think of how to build it, and I didn't really feel like looking for a deck out there. But I think that this deck is Scouts, but with a really inconsistent high roll, and it can beat Scouts with that high roll because of it's good against unit based decks. If you get like Fleet Feather Tracker with if you get shields and challengers or quick attacks, then it's really good. But then when that doesn't happen, which is a lot of the time, you're sitting there with not a lot to do, and that's where I dislike this deck.
This deck starts with basically this deck starts with Fleet Feather on one, and if it's anything else or they're not a unit based deck, you're in a lot of trouble. When it starts Fleet Feather on one and you're playing against a unit based deck, that's when this deck starts to pop off. Especially when you go second and you're like Fleet Feather on one. Okay, then I can follow up with Young Witch or Brightsteel Protector, and I'm just putting myself way ahead. But any start other than that, and you're already kind of in the doghouse because you're just bad Scouts.
Yeah, and if you look at this deck, it looks a lot like Scouts, and that's because it is, but it just has like really inconsistent, mediocre cards, and that's where Scouts is better. Is it just all those cards in a vacuum are really good? They don't need other things to go along with it. Flower Child, this card is really, I'm not a fan of this card. Even the artwork, I fucking hate looking at this card. But outside of that, I'm not a fan of Lulu. I think this card was heavily overrated going into the new set, and now we see a week later, it's been phased out for the most part, but we still see Lulu, Zed, or Shen often. Shen is just, this card's pretty mediocre champion slot. Really never been a fan of it. It has 3 Genevieve, so I'm a fan of that, but I'm just really not feeling this deck.
Yeah, this deck is actually, I know we use it all the time. We've said it like 30 times in the stream, but this deck actually is bad Scouts. Like this is the best descriptor for this deck. This is like the actual bad Scouts deck. So there's not much else to say about this. Yes, it loses extra points because I do hate the Lulu emote, but more so, it's just the high roll version of Scouts, and it's high roll is especially effective against unit based decks, but then once you're up against control decks, I feel like this is just worse Scouts.
Yeah, absolutely, and really just not trying to have that. Let's talk about our deck that we used sparingly to rank to top 10 master. I changed it a little bit. I put in some Oblivious Islanders. I took out the Allegiance cards. I think that this deck, while it is clearly really cheese and not consistent, in limited capacities, or if you're really just feeling lucky some days, I think this deck could tear.
I think this is like, I don't want to say for sure, but it could. There's something there for tournament, I think. I don't know. Maybe it needs a little more support, but I don't think this could be something for tournament. And I don't know for sure, but I think there might be something there.
Yeah, for sure. And we can just talk about Encroaching Shadows is just a really strong card, and at certain points will just be really good unless they do bad things in the game, and that type of deck just doesn't become viable. But just giving these universal blanket buffs to your deck where you can just turn uninteractable cards strong, like Scout or elusives. They're very obvious combinations. So I'm really big on Encroaching Shadows. It's a card that I dislike in a general sense, but I think it's really strong in this deck uh, because of how well it works. A new addition to the deck that I threw in because I think that a very clear detriment of the deck is nothing to do on your opponent's turn after you Encroaching Shadows because you can't actually develop. But a card that's okay with that is Darkwater Scourge. It can just buy you extra turns by virtue of just being this big brick that they don't want to attack into. Um, so I like that. It just gives you more turns to attack with. Islander, I think, can just make you have better plays when you're trying to just pop off, make your guys a little cheaper. But other than that, this deck is really straightforward. You just buff your deck up. Ideally, you would go second with your attack, so you can go pass your 1, 2, maybe develop like a Green Glade do it, and then 3, you'll have enough mana to play the Encroaching Shadows on your opponent's turn. 4, you'll go into that next turn with your buffed deck, and you'll hopefully do some damage, and then turn 6, you'll kill your opponent, because I imagine 2 elusive attack turns with Encroaching Shadows is good enough to kill your opponent, and if it's not, you're gonna lose, but that's why this deck is...
Tried.
Yeah, you did your damnedest. But yeah, I think this deck is cool.
This deck pairs really well with the Lulu emote because it is an absolutely infuriating deck to lose to.
Yeah, it just epitomizes what I talked about at the top is metas in LoR have been defined about being doing things that are uninteractable, and this is very much uninteractable. If I have my Solitaire hand, you're gonna lose.
Right. Pandatone, we talked about the 3-cost spell. It's just terrible because you need your spell mana to play the 4-cost spell. It's too slow. There's about a million ways it goes wrong. It's already after your combos, so you can't really be spending 3 mana after you combo to be doing anything but playing your creatures or playing one of your spells that lets you win the game faster. There's no reason to keep these guys on the board. Like I don't need removal for their creatures. Like I don't need to swap on because they can't block any of my creatures anyways. And their creatures aren't going to be able to win the game fast enough that I need to remove them. It's going to be, I have my combo, I'm going to pop off and they're going to die, or I didn't see my combo and they had a very aggressive start and they won. And that's really all there is to it. I think, yeah, it's a combo deck more than a tempo deck. You're really just trying to see your spell, play it, and then just drop guys and swing in. And I think where you're going to see it shines is against control decks, where even when they can stop you like for a turn, they don't win fast enough, so you just get to another crack at it. Especially with cards like what's the 3/1 that adds a copy to your hand?
Silent Shadowseer.
Yeah, it's Shadowseer. Silent Shadowseer. She's one of the strongest cards in the deck, in my opinion, because she keeps just adding copies, so you get to crack in another 5. She goes back to your hand as a 5, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly, right?
No.
Oh, she goes back as a 3. I can't remember if she went back as a 5 or a 3, but either way, she's very important because she keeps your deck gassed up. So even if, say, your first big push on turn 4 or 5 or whatever fails, you get another big push on the follow up.